A father and son killed outside their rural home.
It's a bloodbath. The minute I open the car, I can smell a flammable liquid.
The house had been burglarized back in 2017.
This seemed to be a targeted attack.
Promising leads quickly unravel.
Their wallets were missing, but there was no burglary of the home, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors.
It was pretty obvious somebody wanted us to believe that it was a robbery.
When detectives track down the gunman, their investigation takes an unexpected turn, exposing a betrayal that leaves a close-knit Christian community in shock.
He said that he was hired to do the job.
There was a text message. She said, yes, that was sort of our code.
Do what? You really want to play stupid? I'm serious now.
She offered him $20,000 to commit that murder.
It didn't sound right to me. I was in complete shock. How could they possibly think that she had done this?
August 18th, 2018. It's just before noon in Horry County, South Carolina, and police are responding to reports of a burned-out vehicle abandoned in a soybean field.
That was unusual because, here's this car sitting in the middle of their field. They had no idea how it had gotten there.
All the doors were closed. It was obvious that the windows were covered in soot from the inside. So the initial officer that arrived opened the door just to see if anybody was inside. Nobody was in the vehicle, but somebody attempted to burn the vehicle.
He ran the license plate through dispatch, got the owner's name and address, and that was Robbie Ford.
They come up with an address roughly 15 to 17 miles away in Conway. They send an officer to the house. It's a residence owned by Mr. Robert Ford, Robbie's father.
The house is in the rural section of Horry County. It's mainly family farms. It's not very populated.
The officer goes there, knocks on the front door, gets no response, attempts to walk around to the back of the house.
He looked to his right and saw a male body laying outside the back door. He saw another male body laying on the grassy area.
The officer checks for signs of life, but both men are dead from apparent gunshot wounds. The older victim appears to be Robert Ford, and the younger one, his son Robbie.
They both shared the same name, Robbie, and then Robert's the dad. It's a bloodbath. Something really bad has happened.
The officer immediately called for assistance, homicide, supervisors, all hands on deck. There was no burglary of the home. The door was still locked when law enforcement got there. There was no broken windows, no kicked-in doors.
So investigators start asking themselves, is there something about either of these victims that would cause someone to target them? So they're really looking to who would have a motive to kill them.
Initial background checks show that Robert Marion Ford was born on May 21st, 1959, in Conway, South Carolina.
Robert was a native of the area, lifelong resident. He was very active in his church, very active in the choir.
He was married to a lady named Sheila. Sheila and Robert had a daughter named Samantha.
Samantha was always the apple of his eye. She had a great relationship with her dad. She loved both her parents very much.
The relationship between Robert and Sheila was strained. So they had gotten a divorce. They saw each other from time to time, but it was a very chilled relationship.
Once he and Samantha's mother divorced, Robert quickly married Melda, who was Robbie's mother. So Samantha and Robbie were half siblings. It seemed as though the family was pretty close, pretty well adjusted. Samantha grew up with her mother, but would certainly visit with her father on a regular basis.
Robbie was always the typical annoying kid brother. Not that Samantha ever treated him like she was annoyed with him or anything. She spent time with him. She loved him.
As Samantha and Robbie got older, Robert worked hard to support them.
He had been a very hard worker, studiously saving money so that he could provide for his children.
Robert also invested in his children's spiritual growth.
He played leadership roles in the church. He was a constant member of the choir, and he went several times a week. So everyone in the community knew Robert, and they all knew Samantha. They all knew Robbie.
But Robert's devotion to the church was challenged when 21-year-old Samantha came to him with some difficult news.
She got pregnant out of wedlock. He wasn't happy about the situation, but he didn't fault her. But the church frowned upon it, even though she has been involved in church her entire life. Her father had to step down as deacon because she's an unwed mother.
To Robert, the decision was simple. When Samantha gave birth to her daughter, he was there for her, despite the scandal it caused in the congregation.
He had a grandchild, so in ways their relationship was strengthened.
He was an amazing grandfather. He loved his kids. He's happy.
Within a few years, Samantha gave birth to twin boys, but her relationship with the children's father didn't last. However, when she met and married a man who worked at the nearby detention center, Samantha found the stability her children needed.
He had adopted her 3 biological children that she had from someone else. Samantha maybe did some work here or there, but nothing steady.
She was always involved with her children. She stayed at home a lot with the kids.
While Samantha settled into family life, Robbie was building a life of his own.
Robbie was also very highly thought of. He had been in school at Clemson studying for an architecture degree and seemed at least on the path to a good career.
He had a good relationship with his niece and nephews. Still had a really good relationship with Samantha. They talked regularly.
But in 2016, the family faced heartbreak when Robert's wife Melda suddenly died. Over the next 2 years, Robbie and Samantha became his support system as he dealt with the grief.
It was just Robbie and Robert living at the home when Robbie was not in college.
There were quite a number of text messages. They would spend time with each other, visit with each other. So at first blush, the family certainly seemed very close.
But on the evening of August 18th, 2018, both Robert and Robbie have been found shot to death outside their home. Shortly after the discovery, Detective Peter Sester arrives to begin an investigation.
We've got a young male. He has what appears to be a gunshot wound in his upper right shoulder and a gunshot wound to the back of the head. The second victim, that would be Robbie's father, Robert Ford. His gunshot wound is a contact wound under the chin. They had some to-go cups with them, maybe some leftover food or something in a bag with them. So they are just peacefully coming in. You begin to think, okay, Robert Ford had to have been shot first because there is no indication of a struggle. That tells me the suspect's standing right there and waiting for them. Robbie Ford is probably attempting to flee from the back of the house when he's shot more than likely in the upper right shoulder first. That puts him to the ground. The second shot is then the suspect coming up behind him and shooting him in the back of the head. At close range, you could see that blood is coagulating. It's beginning to turn darker. I've got to assume it's probably anywhere from 6 to 12 hours earlier that this occurred. Both of the wallets were gone. One of the cars is in the driveway, and obviously the other vehicle that's in the farming field belongs to this residence.
A robbery attempt seems possible, but a search of the home quickly dismisses that theory.
The neighbors were probably about 2 football fields away. This seemed to be a targeted attack in part because someone went specifically to that location in a very rural area. That suggests that they had some knowledge of who lived there or what they might find there.
Both of these two individuals are quiet, law-abiding citizens. The father is a good church-going man, and Robbie's looking forward to going off to school in Charleston. The fact that the father is shot up close and personal, you can't help but think this is a close friend or a relative that's behind this murder.
The initial questions would be, do they have any enemies? Who would want to do this? Who gains from their death?
Coming up, detectives get a lead from something the killer left behind.
Cigarette butts are a perfect source of DNA.
And an insight into the killer's mindset is revealed.
A mask shows that this was not spur of the moment. This was planned out.
To South Carolina police, the murders of 59-year-old Robert Ford and his 25-year-old son Robbie Ford appear to be the result of a targeted attack. But it seems the killer tried to make it look otherwise.
Their wallets were missing, Robbie's vehicle was missing, but it looks like a homicide made to look like a robbery gone bad.
This crime appears to be committed solely on these two individuals. That's telling us that we need to be looking for somebody that may be closely connected to these victims.
News of something happening at the Ford home gets back to loved ones quickly.
Samantha did show up at the scene. It's my understanding that people had called to tell her there was a law enforcement presence at her father and brother's house.
She approached law enforcement. They told her your father and half-brother had been killed.
She seemed pretty shocked about the whole incident. Kind of a normal reaction you would expect from a daughter.
They began asking, when's the last time you heard from them? Do you know what they had been doing recently? And Samantha told investigators that Robert and Robbie had been down in Charleston looking for an apartment for Robbie, who was going to be spending a semester of school down there.
She communicated with them the night before and knew that they would be arriving back on Saturday.
She described her relationship with her father as an excellent relationship. They were very close. She would go and clean his house, bring them meals. She could not think of anyone who would want to harm either her father or her brother.
According to Samantha, the only trouble her father had in the recent past is a break-in.
The house had been burglarized back in 2017, and several items had been taken from the house at that time.
During that burglary, a .38 revolver was stolen, some jewelry, and a laptop.
To investigators, It seems unlikely the burglars would return a year later and not steal anything. They leave Samantha to grieve and make arrangements to follow up with her.
They canvassed the neighborhood and they went to one of the closest neighbors who was kind of across the field. The night before, around 8:45, that neighbor was outside in his yard and heard a gunshot, followed by a scream and another gunshot. He didn't report that to the police at the time because in that area of our county, hearing gunshots is not particularly unusual.
The timing corresponds to what Samantha told investigators. Detective Sestaire directs his attention to the soybean field where Robert's car was abandoned.
This is significant because whoever brought that vehicle there decided that they were going to try and destroy evidence by setting the vehicle on fire. I arrive on scene. You're looking for any type of evidence. I find nothing until I get within about 5 to 10 feet of the vehicle. And just outside the driver's door of the vehicle on the ground, there are 3 cigarette butts that are smoked down almost to the filter. The minute I open the car, I can smell a flammable liquid, gasoline or something of that nature. I also see inside the vehicle, and I think is significant, is on the driver's side floor, there's like a wool ski cap.
When people set out to burn a car, they don't realize that the car has to have a lot of oxygen to continue the burn.
The killer, he didn't roll any windows down or crack a window, so the fire quickly smothered.
Detective Sestaire collects the pieces of evidence and reseals the car to preserve the crime scene.
Cigarette butts are a perfect source of DNA. Skin cells, saliva from your mouth is on the filters of those cigarettes. So that's going to definitely yield a significant profile for us on who our killer may be.
While the crime lab begins analysis of the DNA samples, investigators consider the other evidence left behind.
A mask shows that this was not spur of the moment. This was planned out.
With the investigation underway, the shocking news spreads across the small community.
Robert Ford's family was horrified that he had been murdered and really wanted some justice.
Samantha was completely devastated. She didn't even know, up from down at that moment. They told her they couldn't rule her out. At that point, we just assumed that was typical protocol.
But when investigators contact Samantha to give a statement, she provides an airtight alibi.
There was a convenience store that showed Samantha on surveillance video during the time of the murders. The investigators also got Samantha's phone records. There was no evidence that her phone was using a cell tower near her father's home.
A few weeks later, the DNA samples collected from the burned vehicle provide detectives with a possible new lead.
The State Law Enforcement Division, SLED, determines that both the cigarette butts and the skull cap had the same single source DNA profile. That's like gold in an investigation because it's one person.
I vividly remember there was celebration. We don't know everything, but we fully expected the killer to be in CODIS.
It's been 30 days since the murders of Robert and Robbie Ford, and Horry County investigators have just gotten a huge break in the case.
The DNA profile is that of a white male. We're excited. We're thinking the minute they load that thing into CODIS, we're going to get a hit. You know, this person's got to be in it.
Unfortunately, CODIS did not come back with what we call a hit, so it didn't lead anywhere at that point.
But we now have that it is a white male.
Experts suggest detectives send the samples to a company specializing in ancestral DNA.
You can't DNA everybody. It's a violation of people's privacy. But we'll pay ourselves to send our DNA into 23andMe and all these other companies. Well, the one thing they don't tell you when you sent your DNA off through the mail is through forensic genealogy, law enforcement can have access to it.
That takes time. It was a lot of hard investigative work that went into this, patience, and the longer it takes you, the fear of memories, of evidence, of things happening to people that they're not going to be around later on.
As the months pass, Samantha Rabon moves on with her life.
I had gone to her home, which was formerly her father's home. Her and her husband and her kids moved into it.
Samantha Rabon acted pretty quickly in laying claim to Robert's assets and to any money that was available to her. And I think that certainly got investigators' attention, that she was behaving so quickly. Police found out from Robert Ford's sister that he had insurance policies and that Samantha Rabon was the beneficiary of those policies. But Robbie was actually the primary beneficiary.
Robert had a lot of insurance, and he had a lot of land. So if anything were to happen to Robert, Robbie would get that money.
I know that afterwards she was obtaining money from various insurance policies after her dad and brother had been murdered, and she was renovating her home. So she was benefiting from her father and brother's death for sure.
In August 2020, 2 years after the murders, the DNA lab contacts detectives.
They come back with a partial match. Our suspect has 2 other brothers, and that's great information. And they're both incarcerated, so their DNA was collected in jail. Problem is, they weren't out of jail, so it's definitely not them. But from that, we then develop a potential suspect, and that's Randy Granger. Turns out that he has a criminal history. He had been in prison for, I believe, about 15 years.
Data obtained from the cell tower near the burned vehicle puts Randy in the area when the crime took place.
They discovered a phone number associated with Randy Granger as making a phone call to somebody else on this night. And that phone number came back to a woman named Teresa Martin. Randy Granger and Teresa Martin were dating, boyfriend and girlfriend. Teresa Martin, once investigators start looking into her, is discovered to be a distant relative of Samantha Rabon's mother. She is a cousin. Of course, it raises eyebrows that Randy Granger, whose DNA is at the soybean field, is calling the cousin of Samantha Rabon on the night that her father and her brother have been murdered.
Coming up, a co-conspirator makes a confession.
When he was done with the job, she gave him $20,000.
And exposes the puppet master.
He said that he was hired
To do what?
to kill her daddy.
Nearly 2 years after Robert Ford and his son Robbie Ford were found murdered, South Carolina police interviewed 2 new suspects. A relative of Samantha Rabon, Teresa Martin, and Teresa's boyfriend, 50-year-old Randy Granger.
They're brought in and placed in separate rooms and questioned.
We know he was involved. So even at that point, we've got to get a story as to why this happened. Going into it, it's like, what is your connection with these 2?
Randy is confronted with photos of the burned vehicle and items containing his DNA.
Randy, do you have any idea why you're here? No? What's that?
It's a Ford Escape.
I ain't never seen. You ain't never seen it before? No.
It's a cigarette butt. With DNA on it. It was left right beside the car.
Randy wouldn't say anything about anything.
I know you didn't do this by yourself. What I want is the person who asked you to do it. Do what? You really want to play stupid? I'm serious now. Because I got you right now for at least 2 counts of murder. Arson. Only a lawyer, I guess.
Hitting a brick wall with Randy, detectives hope Teresa will give them more.
Just because you know something doesn't mean you're involved in it. Doesn't mean you can be in trouble for it. But by lying to us, that's where a problem comes. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
At first, Teresa sidesteps their questions about Randy, but she eventually admits he called her to pick him up on the day of the murders.
What did he say?
Nothing. He just got in the car and he said, let's go home.
As police continued to interview her, she engaged in what we call progressive truth-telling. She kept giving them just a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more.
He said that he was hired to do a job.
And he said, who hired him?
He said Samantha.
To do what?
To kill her daddy.
Okay.
About a week before the murders, Teresa says she overheard Randy and Samantha discussing the plan.
She told him that, she, like I said, she had a job for him to do, and I wanted to take care of my daddy and my brother. When he was done with the job, she'd give him $20,000. And she wanted it done before he left to go to college, because she knew if her daddy got killed, then she would have to split everything.
Robbie was actually the primary beneficiary, so it wouldn't have done Samantha much good to kill her father if her brother didn't die at the same time.
Then she is the sole beneficiary of all assets. Those assets include pension plans, life insurance, lots of acreage that her father's home was on, including the home, all these assets up to almost $1 million.
So how did he get to Robert's house?
Well, I took him and dropped him off. And he told me that he got the gun from Samantha. He said he's gonna wait in the woods until they come home.
You remember what time?
It wasn't dark yet.
There was a text message from Teresa Martin to Samantha Rabon, "I'm home alone." They confronted her with that. At first she denied that it meant anything. Eventually she said, yes, that was sort of our code, that I had dropped Randy off.
The interview gives detectives what they need to secure an arrest warrant for Samantha. She is immediately arrested at her mother's residence.
They actually timed Samantha's arrest for the 2-year anniversary of the murders. Samantha Rabon was initially charged with murder and criminal conspiracy.
News of the alleged murder plot stuns everyone in the community.
I heard all these rumors, but I took it with a grain of salt because it didn't sound right to me. This is not the young lady that I've grown to know.
I was in complete shock when they arrested her. How could they possibly think that she had done this?
Once Samantha's arrested, she doesn't talk. She doesn't claim to be involved in any way, shape, form, or fashion.
Before I ask you any questions, just want you to know, I already talked to Randy. And Randy's in jail. Okay? Do you want to talk to us?
No. See how does my lawyer come? He's like, what happened next?
Now with a warrant, police obtain Samantha's cell phone. Investigators turn it over to a detective who specializes in electronic crimes.
I deal with anything that has digital evidence. I got the cell phone. I began using keyword searches and searching for insurance. I began murder and different search criterias to go through the device.
Some of the more interesting web searches were how quickly you can clean up a double homicide. How quickly can you get a passport?
There were other searches. Does God forgive murderers? Can you be a suspect in a murder and never get charged?
There is a lot of real damning search history that really feeds in to the fact that she has played a significant role in the death of her father and her brother.
After 2 years of investigation, Samantha Rabon has been charged with plotting a murder for hire to get rid of her father and brother. Once the case is handed over to prosecutors, they focus on getting Samantha's co-conspirators to turn against her.
Teresa Martin had basically admitted some of her involvement, and she quickly agreed to cooperate. Randy Granger would not, so I determined that it was easier to try him first.
On April 3rd, 2023, Teresa pleads guilty to being an accessory.
Teresa Martin never goes to trial, takes a plea, and agrees to testify in both Randy and Samantha Rabon's trials.
The same day she takes a plea, she provides witness testimony at Randy's trial.
The police get what we call a buccal swab, a known DNA standard from him. That DNA standard is sent to SLED, and SLED is able to say, yes, that DNA standard matches the single source DNA profile from the cigarette butts in the ski cab at the scene.
Randy Granger is found guilty and sentenced to 2 life terms for the murder of Robert and Robbie Ford.
After his conviction of 2 counts of murder, arson, and other charges, Randy has a change of heart.
Randy at that point agreed to testify against Samantha Rabon.
According to Randy, Samantha's relationships with her father and brother weren't as rosy as police had been led to believe.
Samantha was the child of a previous marriage, whereas Robbie had grown up with both of his parents in the same home. So I think there was a little bit of tension there because Robbie may have been perceived as being the favored child in the family dynamic.
There was talk about Samantha being unhappy about Robbie maybe getting a little more inheritance than she did.
Randy says Samantha approached him at her mother's house with a plan to profit off their deaths.
Randy Granger said that Samantha Rabon gave him the gun that day on the porch. She said that they both had to die at the same time, and she offered him $20,000 to commit that murder.
About a week later, Randy and Teresa executed the plan.
Teresa Martin dropped Randy off at Robert and Robbie Ford's home. Randy Granger waited hours and hours and smoked cigarettes while he was waiting for them to come home. He knew that they were going to be at dinner. He just didn't know exactly when they would get home.
Around 8:45 p.m., he heard tires on the gravel driveway.
Robert got out of the passenger side of Robbie's car first and was walking to go up the back steps to his home. And he shot Robert Ford in the face. Randy says he hears Robbie scream, and he is running, and so he shoots Robbie in the back. And then he goes over and shoots Robbie in the back of the head. He walks back over to Robert and shoots him under his chin. And he takes their wallets, and he takes the keys to the Ford Escape that was Robbie's. And he drives it to a field, and he attempts to burn it.
Once the car was on fire, Randy called Teresa to pick him up. But he'd made a few crucial mistakes.
He had smoked basically a pack of cigarettes, and then he put the cigarettes in his socks to keep from leaving evidence there.
He didn't realize that his socks had rolled down and the cigarettes he'd been stashing from Robert's house had fallen outside the car onto the ground. And he thought that the skull cap would have burned up, but they didn't.
The intent was to completely destroy the vehicle. He just neglected to leave a window open to allow oxygen to get into it.
After the double homicide, Randy found out it was all for nothing.
He never received $20,000 from Samantha Rabon. Randy was upset at first, but you can't call the police.
With Randy and Teresa's help, prosecutors believe they have enough to convict Samantha. But they know when it comes to juries, a guilty verdict is never certain.
I think the strongest thing that we had going for us was a clear motive. But anytime you were dependent on a testifying co-defendant, you always worry because it's very easy cross-examination for the defense attorney. What you're doing is to get a better deal. They have a built-in motive to fabricate. So there was a lot of pressure on us to get the right result.
On February 21st, 2024, Samantha Rabon stands trial for the murders of her family members, Robert and Robbie Ford.
It was a full 6 years after we discovered that gruesome scene off Highway 19, so way past due.
For Samantha's trial, the whole victim side of the courtroom was packed with family, with friends. There were still some supporters for Samantha Rabon on her side, including her husband and some other family members.
Prosecutors rely heavily on Randy Granger's testimony.
I will say I thought Randy's testimony was extremely effective. It had a ring of truth to it that you couldn't deny.
They argue the burglary at the Ford home, during which the murder weapon was stolen, is evidence of premeditation.
It does seem that Samantha Rabon was certainly responsible for that burglary, which shows us that she had been thinking about having her father killed and her brother killed for at least a year before and was actually going to use her father's own gun to do it.
Samantha finally reached a breaking point. Her income was not meeting her outgo, and I think she snapped because there was a solution And that solution to make her a millionaire was going to cost her her dad and her brother.
Samantha's defense team attempts to undermine Randy's credibility.
The defense, of course, is going to paint a cooperating state's witness, a man that admits to pulling the trigger, as not to be trusted.
Randy Granger did tell us what he had done with the gun. He said that he threw it into sort of a creek running along a road, but we were never able to find the gun.
Samantha Rabon was adamant that she didn't do it, and that just because she benefited, I'm sure she probably thought that doesn't mean I'm a murderer.
On February 28, 2024, after 2 hours, the jury reaches a decision.
When he said that she was guilty, inside I was screaming and crying and having a complete breakdown.
She was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole and was taken away that day.
I still don't understand. I'm just still so overwhelmed and lost in the feeling of there's no true factual evidence that I can see.
100% justice was served. She is the one that set this plan in motion, and she is where she belongs.
Although the gunman, Randy Granger, helped prosecutors convict Samantha, he doesn't fare much better.
The state filed a motion asking a judge to allow him to be resentenced, but the judge only turned it from 2 consecutive life terms to 2 concurrent life terms, so not much of a break for him in the end.
I know there was a huge sense of relief for Robert's family and for that community where Robert lived. He was extremely active in his church and had a lot of friends out there, and I think they were relieved to finally see some justice in this case.
Who would want to think that anyone in their family would have the ability to draft up a plan like this, to have somebody executed simply over money? Samantha felt she needed it all. Greed got the better end of her.
Nobody expected an abandoned farmhouse outside a forgotten Texas highway to rewrite a story that had haunted an entire county for nearly 3 decades. The wind still carried the same dry dust across the empty fields. Rusted barbed wire still groaned under the weight of time. The wooden porch still leaned toward the earth as if exhausted from keeping secrets. Nothing about the place suggested history was about to change. Until a forensic technician knelt beside a splintered floorboard and found something everyone else had stepped over for 28 years. One microscopic stain. Almost invisible. Almost erased. But not completely. Long before laboratories could read genetic evidence with extraordinary precision, it had simply been another useless mark on old wood. Another detail buried inside thousands of pages of forgotten reports. Another failure filed away beneath a stamp that investigators dreaded more than any other. Cold case. For years, parents warned their children not to drive the back roads after sunset. Hunters avoided the abandoned property without explaining why. Teenagers dared each other to walk through the collapsing house at night, returning pale-faced, each insisting they had heard footsteps that weren't their own. Some claimed the place was cursed. Others insisted someone had escaped justice and was still watching. The truth was far more frightening, because nobody knew what had really happened. October 1998 arrived colder than expected. Northern winds swept across central Texas, carrying dead leaves across long stretches of empty highway. Ranches sat miles apart. Cell phones were rare. Darkness swallowed entire roads after sunset, leaving only distant headlights cutting through endless black. At 8:17 p.m., dispatch received a call. The voice on the other end struggled to breathe. A truck driver had noticed a sedan parked near an abandoned farmhouse several miles off State Highway 84. The driver's first assumption was mechanical trouble. That changed the moment he walked closer. The driver's door stood open. The engine had gone cold. The headlights remained on. A purse rested on the passenger seat. Keys still hung from the ignition. But the owner was nowhere. Deputies arrived within minutes. Flashlights swept across dry grass shimmering beneath the moonlight. Tire tracks crossed loose gravel before disappearing into harder ground, where the earth refused to preserve evidence. Officers searched the surrounding fields expecting to find an injured driver who had wandered away. Instead, they found signs of panic. One shoe, broken fingernails scattered beside the porch, fresh scrape marks across weathered wooden steps. A silver necklace snapped clean in half. Then, silence. No body. No blood large enough to explain violence. No witnesses. No screams reported by nearby residents. Only questions multiplying faster than answers. The missing woman was identified before midnight. 26-year-old Emily Carter. She worked as a veterinary assistant in a neighboring town, known for never missing work, never ignoring family calls, never changing plans without telling someone first. Friends described her as careful, organized, the type of person who filled her gas tank before it dropped below half and carried emergency supplies in the trunk. Nothing about her routine suggested she would voluntarily disappear. Detectives immediately interviewed everyone closest to her. Parents, co-workers, neighbors, friends, her fiancé. Each conversation painted nearly the same portrait. Responsible, reliable, happy, planning a wedding the following spring. There were no obvious enemies, no financial crisis, no hidden criminal record, no indication she wanted to leave. Investigators searched her apartment. Everything remained untouched. Clothes folded neatly. Wedding invitations stacked on the dining table. A half-finished grocery list attached to the refrigerator. Coffee still sitting inside the machine from that morning. Every ordinary detail somehow made the disappearance feel even more impossible. The first 48 hours produced hundreds of tips. Most led nowhere. Someone thought they saw her at a gas station. Wrong person. Another caller reported hearing screams near the river. Animal noises. A waitress believed Emily had eaten breakfast 2 counties away. Mistaken identity. Hope rose. Collapsed. Rose again. Collapsed once more. Search teams combed fields, ponds, drainage ditches, abandoned wells, and dense patches of cedar. Helicopters circled overhead while volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder across miles of rough terrain. Nothing. Not a single trace. The media quickly transformed the disappearance into regional headlines. Missing Texas woman. Mystery off Highway 84. Where is Emily Carter? Television cameras gathered outside the sheriff's office every afternoon waiting for updates that never came. Each briefing sounded painfully similar. No suspects. No arrests. Investigation ongoing. Behind closed doors, detectives admitted something they hated saying aloud. They had almost nothing. The abandoned farmhouse became the center of the investigation. Crime scene specialists photographed every wall, every broken window, every footprint, every cigarette butt, every discarded bottle. Thousands of fingerprints covered the property, accumulated over decades of trespassers, drifters, and curious teenagers. Separating meaningful evidence from random contamination became nearly impossible. The house itself seemed determined to resist explanation. One bedroom contained children's wallpaper peeling from cracked plaster. Another held nothing except an overturned rocking chair. In the kitchen, dishes remained inside cabinets despite the roof collapsing years earlier. Dust covered nearly every surface, except one narrow hallway. There, investigators noticed several unusually clean footprints. Not fresh enough for detailed impressions. Not old enough to ignore. Just enough to deepen the mystery. Rain arrived before forensic teams could preserve additional evidence. Whatever secrets the ground had been holding washed away overnight. The county sheriff refused to accept defeat. Every deputy worked overtime. Old records were reviewed repeatedly. Known offenders living nearby were questioned. Parolees. Violent criminals. Drifters. Registered offenders. Truck drivers using the highway. No connection survived scrutiny. Weeks became months. Emily's photograph remained taped inside convenience stores across Texas. Christmas arrived. Her family left presents unopened beneath the tree. They insisted she would come home. New Year's passed. Then another birthday. Still nothing. Rumors began replacing facts. Some claimed Emily had witnessed organized crime activity. Others insisted she had run away to escape an unhappy relationship. Psychics called investigators promising visions. Anonymous letters accused innocent neighbors. The case slowly transformed into something dangerous. Speculation. Every unanswered question invited another theory. Every theory pulled attention further away from evidence. Detective Raymond Holt refused to let the file disappear. Nearly every evening he returned to the evidence room after everyone else had gone home. He studied photographs until midnight, searching for patterns hidden inside ordinary details. One image bothered him more than the others. The front porch. Specifically, a single missing floorboard. Photographs taken before investigators removed evidence clearly showed a narrow gap between weathered planks. Yet later photographs revealed the board had shifted slightly, exposing darker wood beneath. At first glance it appeared insignificant. Buildings settle. Wood expands. Nothing unusual. Still, something felt wrong. Holt requested technicians examine the plank again. Nothing. No fingerprints. No weapon. No fibers. Just old timber scarred by years of neglect. His request was quietly dismissed. Resources moved elsewhere. Fresh cases demanded attention. The Emily Carter investigation slowly drifted toward the shelves reserved for files nobody wanted to discuss. Families measured time differently from detectives. Every holiday became another reminder. Every unanswered phone call rekindled impossible hope. Emily's mother refused to disconnect her daughter's voicemail. Her father drove the same stretch of highway every Sunday evening, convinced he might notice something everyone else had missed. Nothing ever changed. Except the calendar. Years rolled forward. Sheriffs retired. Deputies transferred. Evidence boxes collected dust inside climate-controlled storage. Technology evolved while memories faded. Witnesses moved away. Some died. Others forgot small details that might once have mattered. The official label finally arrived. Cold case. 2 words. Enough to close office doors. Enough to end budget requests. Enough to convince most people that the truth would never be known. But evidence does not age the way memories do. Sometimes, it waits. Patiently. Silently. Until science finally learns how to hear what it has been saying all along. For years, the name Emily Carter existed in Texas as a question without an answer. A photograph on a missing persons poster. A face on a faded newspaper clipping. A voice trapped inside old family recordings. The world moved forward, but for the people who loved her, time remained frozen on one terrifying night in October 1998. The abandoned farmhouse slowly became a symbol of everything investigators could not explain. The place where a woman vanished. The place where evidence disappeared. The place where a killer, if there had been one, seemed to have left behind nothing. But every cold case has a moment when the silence begins to break. For Emily Carter's case, that moment came years later, when a new generation of investigators opened the forgotten files and discovered that the past had not been erased. It had been waiting. By 2019, the original investigation team had almost completely changed. Sheriff's offices had modernized. Digital databases replaced paper archives. Advances in forensic science transformed evidence, once considered useless, into potential breakthroughs. Old cases were being reopened across the country. Cases that had survived decades without answers. Cases that had become permanent scars on communities. Emily Carter's disappearance was one of them. The file was pulled from storage on a rainy Tuesday morning by Detective Lena Morales, a newly assigned cold case investigator known for refusing to accept impossible endings. She had spent years studying abandoned investigations. She understood something many people forgot. A cold case was not a dead case. It was a case waiting for the right question. When Morales opened the box containing Emily's file, she expected to find damaged paperwork, outdated photographs, and incomplete theories. Instead, she found hundreds of pages documenting one of the most frustrating investigations in county history. Every interview, every search report, every failed lead, every piece of evidence collected from the farmhouse. She spent the first week reading without interruption, the second week comparing, the third week looking for something everyone else had missed. Then she found the photograph. The same photograph Detective Holt had studied decades earlier. The porch, the missing floorboard, the dark space beneath it. Morales stopped. She enlarged the image, then enlarged it again. Something about the angle bothered her. The original investigators had focused on what was visible. She focused on what was hidden. The farmhouse had been searched in 1998 with technology available at the time. Investigators collected obvious evidence. They tested what they knew how to test. But science had changed. A trace that meant nothing in 1998 could mean everything now. Morales requested a complete re-examination of the evidence. The response was cautious. The case was old. Resources were limited. The chances of finding anything useful after 20 years were considered extremely low. But Morales pushed forward. The evidence boxes were transported from storage back into the forensic laboratory. Inside were the remains of a forgotten investigation. Old clothing, photographs, personal belongings, items recovered from the farmhouse. Each object carried a story. Each object carried the possibility of an answer. Among them was the broken silver necklace found on the porch. The necklace had been examined decades earlier. Investigators believed it was damaged during a struggle. But no usable fingerprints had been recovered. No DNA technology capable of identifying a person existed at the time. For years it had been considered worthless. Now, it became interesting again. Laboratory specialists carefully reopened the evidence. They worked slowly. Every movement was documented. Every sample preserved. The first tests produced nothing significant. Then came the second round. A technician discovered microscopic biological material attached to the necklace clasp. A sample so small that it could easily have been dismissed years earlier. But now, it could be analyzed. The discovery changed the atmosphere around the case. For the first time in decades, investigators had something they had never truly possessed. Possible connection, possible person, a possible answer. The sample was submitted for advanced DNA analysis. The wait began, and waiting became the hardest part. Because cold case investigators know the cruel reality. A promising discovery does not always lead to justice. Sometimes DNA belongs to an unknown person. Sometimes databases produce no match. Sometimes the strongest evidence still leaves investigators standing at the same unanswered question. Who? For Emily's family, the news was both exciting and terrifying. After 20 years of disappointment, they had learned to protect themselves from hope. They had heard promises before. They had watched investigators come and go. They had seen headlines appear and disappear. Emily's mother, now older and living quietly outside the city, struggled to believe another breakthrough could happen. She had spent years imagining different endings, most of them painful, some impossible. But she agreed to meet Detective Morales. During their conversation, she placed an old photograph of Emily on the table. Not the missing person photograph used by the media. Personal one. Emily laughing at a family barbecue. Emily holding a rescued dog. Emily unaware that her life would become one of Texas's most haunting mysteries. She was not a mystery, her mother said. She was my daughter. Those words stayed with Morales. Because cold cases often become numbers, files, evidence boxes, statistics. But behind every investigation is someone who waited, someone who wondered, someone who never stopped hoping. The DNA results finally arrived 3 weeks later. The laboratory report was only several pages long. But inside those pages was information that could change everything. The sample belonged to a male. A complete genetic profile had been developed. The next step was comparison. Investigators searched available databases. The result came back negative. No match. For a moment, the excitement disappeared. The breakthrough seemed to collapse. The DNA existed, but the person behind it remained unknown. Another dead end. Another unanswered question. But Morales noticed something important. The DNA was not the end of the investigation. It was the beginning. A person had touched that necklace. A person had been close enough to Emily to leave evidence behind. A person connected to the night she disappeared. The case was no longer a mystery without a direction. It had a path. Investigators returned to the farmhouse records. They reviewed every name connected to the property, every person interviewed, every person who had entered the scene, every person who had once been considered irrelevant. They discovered something unexpected. In 1998, dozens of people had been near the farmhouse during the weeks before and after Emily vanished. Construction workers, hunters, local teenagers, travelers, neighbors. The area had been busier than investigators originally believed. The question changed. Not who could have done this, but who had been there. The search expanded. Detectives began rebuilding the past. They mapped movements. They reviewed forgotten statements. They contacted witnesses who had not spoken to authorities in decades. Some remembered details differently. Some admitted they had forgotten things. And some revealed information they had never shared before. One former neighbor mentioned something that immediately caught investigators' attention. A truck. A dark blue pickup parked near the farmhouse the night Emily disappeared. The witness had assumed it belonged to someone investigating the abandoned property. At the time, nobody followed up. Because everyone was searching for Emily. Nobody was searching for a truck. The detail was buried inside an old notebook. One sentence. One forgotten observation. One possible clue. After 20 years, the investigation had finally found movement. The cold case was no longer silent. And somewhere in Texas, someone who had spent decades believing the truth would remain buried, was about to discover that the past had finally caught up. The forgotten detail of a dark blue pickup truck changed everything. For 20 years, it had existed as nothing more than a single sentence written inside an old witness statement. Passing observation. A detail that seemed too ordinary to matter. In 1998, investigators were searching for a missing woman. They were looking for a person, a body, a crime scene, a confession. They were not looking for a vehicle. They were not looking for a shadow that disappeared into the darkness. They were not looking for someone who had quietly watched the investigation unfold from a distance. But now, in 2019, Detective Lena Morales saw the case differently. She was no longer limited by the assumptions of the original investigation. She was looking backward with modern tools. And sometimes, the smallest forgotten detail becomes the loudest voice from the past. The old witness was identified as Thomas Reed, a retired mechanic who had lived less than 2 miles from the abandoned farmhouse in 1998. His original statement was only 3 paragraphs long. At the time, investigators considered him cooperative but unreliable. Not because he had lied. Because he had not seen enough. He had been driving home that night after closing his repair shop. He remembered passing the farmhouse and noticing a vehicle near the entrance. A dark blue pickup. Older model. No front license plate visible. He remembered the headlights were off. He remembered thinking it was strange. But then he kept driving. In the original investigation, the detail was never developed. No vehicle database search was performed. No owner list was created. No connection was established. The note remained buried. Until now. Detective Morales contacted Reed. The interview took place on a quiet afternoon inside his small home filled with decades of photographs, old tools, and memories from a town that had changed dramatically. When Morales placed the old statement on the table, Reed stared at the handwriting. "I haven't seen this in years," he said. Then came the question. "Do you remember the truck?" Reed looked away. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he answered, "Yes." That single word changed the direction of the investigation. Reed explained that he had not thought about the truck for years, until he saw Emily's photograph on the news back in 1998. He remembered feeling something was wrong. Not because he knew what happened. Because the truck did not belong there. The farmhouse had been abandoned for years. Nobody maintained it. Nobody visited it regularly. A stranger's vehicle parked there after dark had seemed unusual. But in a small rural community, unusual did not always mean suspicious. People minded their own business. They assumed someone else knew more. They assumed someone else would ask the right questions. And sometimes, nobody did. Investigators began reconstructing every vehicle possibly connected to the farmhouse in October 1998. The search was slow. Vehicle records from that era were incomplete. Some owners had moved. Some vehicles had been sold multiple times. Some records existed only on paper. But the team continued. They followed names, addresses, employment histories, connections. Then they found a name that stopped the room. Caleb Voss. In 1998, Voss was 34 years old. He worked as a contractor doing temporary repair jobs throughout several counties. His name appeared once in the original investigation. Only once. He had been questioned because he had performed maintenance work on a nearby property months earlier. Investigators noted no reason to consider him a suspect. He answered questions. He cooperated. He had an explanation for his location that night. The file was closed. But now, decades later, something looked different. Caleb Voss owned a dark blue pickup truck. A 1994 Ford F-150. The same type of vehicle described by Thomas Reed. The discovery did not prove anything. A truck was not a crime. A person being near a location was not evidence of guilt. But cold cases are built from connections. One thread. Then another. Then another. Investigators pulled Voss's history. They discovered he had left Texas several years after Emily disappeared. He had moved through multiple states. Changed jobs. Changed addresses. Avoided attention. Nothing in his record connected him directly to Emily. No arrests. No convictions. No obvious warning signs. But investigators noticed something else. When Morales reviewed the old interview transcripts, she found a strange detail. During his 1998 interview, Voss had mentioned something he should not have known. Something investigators had never released publicly. He referred to the farmhouse porch. Specifically, he mentioned that Emily's necklace had been found near the steps. The problem? That information had not been released to the public at that time. Morales immediately reopened the original interview. She read the statement again. Then again. The sentence was there. Buried among ordinary answers. A detail nobody questioned. A detail that suddenly became impossible to ignore. The investigation changed overnight. The DNA profile from the necklace. The dark blue pickup truck. The unreleased information. 3 separate pieces. Now connected. But connection was not conviction. Detectives needed more. They needed evidence strong enough to survive a courtroom. They needed to know whether Caleb Voss was connected to Emily Carter's disappearance, or whether they were chasing another coincidence. The team began surveillance. They located Voss living quietly in a small town outside Texas. He was older now. Gray hair. Slower movements. A man who appeared completely removed from the tragedy that had defined another family's life. Neighbors described him as polite, reserved, helpful, the kind of person nobody suspected. But investigators knew appearances meant little. Some secrets survive because nobody thinks to look behind them. A warrant was obtained to collect a new DNA sample. The comparison would determine whether the genetic profile found on Emily's necklace belonged to Caleb Voss. The waiting period began again. Hours felt like days. Days felt like years. The entire investigation rested on a laboratory result. Then the phone rang. The DNA comparison was complete. The result was not a match. For a moment the case seemed to collapse. The strongest lead vanished. The person investigators believed could finally explain Emily's disappearance was not connected by DNA. The team sat in silence. Another false path. Another door closed. But Detective Morales refused to accept defeat. Because something important had happened. The investigation had uncovered something impossible to ignore. Someone knew details they should not have known. Someone had been near the farmhouse. Someone had information that had remained hidden for 20 years. The DNA belonged to someone else. Which meant the question became even more disturbing. If Caleb Voss was not the source of the evidence, then who was? The investigation moved deeper into the past. And the answer was buried somewhere inside a forgotten night in October 1998, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. The DNA result should have ended one path. Instead, it opened another. For 20 years, investigators had been chasing shadows. A missing woman. An abandoned farmhouse. A trail that vanished into darkness. Every promising lead eventually collapsed, leaving behind nothing but another unanswered question. But now there was something different. A name had been eliminated. A theory had been destroyed. And yet the evidence remained. The DNA found on Emily Carter's necklace belonged to someone. Someone who had been close enough to leave behind a trace. Someone who had touched an object connected to the final moments of her life. The question haunting the investigation was no longer whether the evidence mattered. It was who the evidence belonged to. Detective Lena Morales returned to the laboratory report and studied every line. Male DNA profile. High-quality sample. Not a contamination issue. Not random background material. The genetic evidence was real. The mystery was the person behind it. The first database search had produced no result. That meant the individual had never been entered into the system. No qualifying arrest. No previous conviction. No stored DNA profile. Whoever left that evidence behind had spent more than 2 decades outside the reach of forensic databases. But Morales knew something about people connected to old crimes. They rarely disappear completely. They leave traces. A job application. A forgotten address. A family connection. A photograph. A conversation someone remembers years later. The investigation expanded. Every person who had ever been connected to the farmhouse was reviewed again. The original witness list contained dozens of names. Most had been cleared. Some had moved away. Some could no longer be located. But one category caught investigators' attention. People who had entered the farmhouse before Emily disappeared. The abandoned property had been considered empty for years. But empty did not mean untouched. Teenagers had explored it. Travelers had used it as shelter. Workers had passed through. And among those names was someone investigators had never seriously considered. Daniel Mercer. In 1998, Mercer was 22 years old. He worked seasonal construction jobs and lived in a nearby town with his older brother. His name appeared briefly in the original case file. He had admitted visiting the farmhouse several times. Like many local teenagers, he had gone there because of rumors. Stories spread quickly. People said strange things happened inside. They said the place felt wrong. They said anyone who stayed there after midnight would hear something. To teenagers, the abandoned farmhouse was a challenge. A place to prove courage. Mercer told investigators in 1998 that he had visited the property with friends weeks before Emily disappeared. He had never been considered a suspect. There was no evidence connecting him to the crime. No witness placed him there that night. No physical evidence pointed toward him. His name remained just another entry in a crowded file. Until now. Morales studied his original statement. Something stood out. Mercer had described the inside of the farmhouse in unusual detail. He knew about rooms most visitors never entered. He knew about the collapsed section near the back hallway. He knew the basement door was difficult to open. Details that seemed meaningless in 1998 suddenly felt different. Morales requested information about Mercer's current location. The search took several days. The man who had once lived near the farmhouse was no longer in Texas. He had moved several times, changed careers, started a family, built a life far away from the investigation that had once surrounded him. But investigators found him, and they decided to ask questions. The interview was conducted quietly. No accusations. No confrontation. Just questions. Morales placed old photographs of the farmhouse on the table. Then she watched his reaction. At first, Mercer appeared calm. He answered casually. He remembered visiting the property. He remembered rumors. He remembered Emily's disappearance. Then Morales placed one photograph in front of him. The porch. The exact location where the necklace had been recovered. His expression changed. Only for a second. But investigators noticed. A small reaction. A moment of recognition. Something hidden beneath decades of distance. Morales asked a simple question. Have you ever been back there after 1998? Mercer answered immediately. No. Too quickly. The response itself was not evidence. But the hesitation afterward was. Investigators left the interview without an arrest. They did not have enough. They needed proof. The DNA sample still belonged to an unknown person. The comparison with Mercer had not been made. And without a legal sample, the investigation could go no further. So detectives began searching for another way. They looked at Mercer's past, his employment history, his family connections, his movements, everything. Then they found something unexpected. In the weeks after Emily disappeared, Mercer had suddenly left town. He told friends he wanted a fresh start. He moved hundreds of miles away. At the time, nobody thought much about it. People left small towns every day. Young people searched for opportunities elsewhere. But now the timing raised questions. Why leave immediately after one of the biggest crimes in county history? Was it coincidence? Or was it something more? Investigators also discovered another detail. Mercer had once worked for a contractor who performed repairs near the abandoned farmhouse. The same property where Emily's car was found. The same property where the necklace was discovered. The same location connected to the unknown DNA profile. The case was no longer a collection of random facts. It was becoming a pattern. But patterns could be misleading. Investigators had learned that lesson before. They had followed the wrong person. They had trusted the wrong clues. They had spent years watching theories collapse. So they moved carefully. A hidden DNA sample was collected from an object Mercer had discarded. The sample was sent to the laboratory. Once again, the investigators waited. Once again, a family hoped. Once again, a cold case stood on the edge of a possible breakthrough. Days passed. Then the call came. The laboratory technician's voice was calm, professional, almost emotionless. But the words changed everything. The DNA profile from the discarded item had been compared with the evidence recovered from Emily Carter's necklace. The result was clear. A match. After 20 years of silence, the evidence had finally spoken. The person who had unknowingly carried the secret of that night was no longer a question. He had a name. Daniel Mercer. But the discovery created an even bigger mystery. Because if Mercer's DNA was on Emily's necklace, why had he never been identified? Why had he left town? And most importantly, what exactly happened inside that abandoned farmhouse on the night Emily Carter disappeared? The answer was still buried beneath decades of silence. And now investigators were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The DNA match changed the investigation forever. After 20 years of unanswered questions, the name Daniel Mercer was no longer just another forgotten detail inside a dusty case file. It was a name connected to the final evidence left behind by Emily Carter. A name linked to the abandoned farmhouse. A name tied to a mystery that had haunted an entire community for decades. But for Detective Lena Morales, the DNA result was not the ending. It was the beginning. Because a DNA match could answer one question. Who left the evidence behind? But it could not answer the question that mattered most. What happened that night? The morning after the match was confirmed, the atmosphere inside the sheriff's office changed completely. The same file that had spent years sitting untouched was suddenly at the center of attention. Investigators who had never worked the original case began studying photographs from 1998. New analysts reviewed old reports. Every detail was questioned. Every assumption was challenged. The discovery of Daniel Mercer forced investigators to look back at the entire timeline. Not through the eyes of people searching for a missing woman, but through the eyes of someone who may have been there. The first step was rebuilding Mercer's connection to Emily. At the time of the disappearance, Daniel Mercer was not a stranger. He lived in the same county. He knew the abandoned farmhouse. He knew the roads surrounding it. And according to old employment records, he had worked several temporary construction jobs in the same area where Emily disappeared. But investigators still needed to understand one thing. Why was his DNA on the necklace? The silver necklace was not found inside the farmhouse. It was discovered outside, near the porch. A location that suggested a struggle. A location that suggested Emily had been there. And now, a location connected to Mercer. Investigators returned to the original crime scene photographs. The farmhouse looked exactly as they remembered. Broken windows, rotting wood, a collapsed roof, an atmosphere of abandonment. But with modern analysis, the smallest details became important. A photograph showed the porch steps. Another showed the damaged necklace. Another showed the area where Emily's car had been found. The investigators noticed something they had overlooked decades earlier. The distance between the vehicle and the porch was not random. Someone had parked the car. Someone had opened the door. Someone had walked from the vehicle to the farmhouse. The question was whether Emily walked there willingly, or whether she was forced. The answer remained hidden. Investigators brought Mercer in for questioning. This time the conversation was different. 20 years earlier, he had been a witness. Now, he was the person connected to the evidence. Mercer arrived without resistance. He looked older, calmer. The young man from 1998 had become someone almost unrecognizable. Gray hair replaced dark brown. Lines covered his face. But detectives knew time could change appearances. Could not erase history. Morales placed the DNA report on the table. She watched his reaction. First nothing. Then a slow breath. A slight movement of his hands. A moment of silence. "You know why we're here," Morales said. Mercer stared at the report. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he asked a question. "How long have you known?" The room became silent. It was not an admission. Not yet. But it was a reaction investigators had been waiting for. Mercer was no longer asking why they were there. He was asking when they discovered the truth. The interview continued for hours. At first, Mercer denied involvement. He admitted knowing Emily. He admitted visiting the farmhouse. He admitted touching the necklace. But he claimed it happened before the disappearance. He said he had found the necklace weeks earlier and picked it up out of curiosity. Investigators listened carefully. Because every suspect has a story. The question is whether the story survives pressure. Mercer claimed he had nothing to do with Emily's disappearance. He said he saw her car that night but assumed she had stopped because of mechanical problems. He said he left before anything happened. He said he never returned. But investigators found problems. Small contradictions. Details that did not match. The biggest issue was timing. Mercer's explanation required him to have been at the farmhouse before Emily disappeared. But evidence suggested the necklace had been damaged during the confrontation that night. Not weeks earlier. Not days earlier. That same night. Detectives continued digging into Mercer's past. They discovered that he had changed his story before. Not about Emily. About his reason for leaving Texas. In 1998, he told friends he moved away for better work opportunities. But records showed something different. He left less than a month after Emily vanished. He sold his belongings. Quit his job. Stopped contacting several people who knew him. A sudden departure. A sudden disappearance. Almost as if he wanted distance from something. Investigators also located a former friend named Kevin Lawson, who had spent time with Mercer before the move. Lawson agreed to speak. What he revealed reopened another part of the investigation. According to Lawson, Mercer had been acting strangely after Emily disappeared. He avoided conversations about the farmhouse. He became angry whenever people mentioned the case. And one night, weeks after the disappearance, Mercer allegedly said something Lawson never forgot. He said nobody would ever find out what happened there. At the time, Lawson thought it was a disturbing joke. A young man trying to sound mysterious. Years later, the memory felt different. Investigators documented the statement, but continued searching for stronger evidence. Because memories could be unreliable. People remembered things differently after decades. A confession was needed. Or physical evidence. Something undeniable. The farmhouse was searched again. This time using technology unavailable in 1998. Ground-penetrating equipment scanned beneath the property. Specialists examined areas previously ignored. Every inch of the structure was analyzed. Then, beneath the old hallway near the damaged floorboard, they found something. A small object hidden beneath layers of dirt and debris. An item that had remained untouched for 20 years. Investigators carefully removed it. The discovery was immediately sent for testing. Nobody in the office wanted to say what they were thinking, because after decades of uncertainty, the truth might finally be close. The object was connected to Emily, connected to the farmhouse, connected to the night she vanished. And when the laboratory report returned, investigators realized the cold case they thought they understood was far more disturbing than anyone imagined. The evidence had not only revealed who was connected to Emily Carter's disappearance, it had revealed that the farmhouse itself had been hiding one final secret. A secret buried for 20 years. A secret that would change everything. For 20 years, the abandoned farmhouse had stood as a silent witness. Its broken walls had absorbed the sound of investigators searching for answers. Its empty rooms had watched detectives come and go. Its damaged floors had carried secrets that no person could uncover. Until now, the discovery beneath the old hallway changed the entire direction of the investigation. A small object, hidden beneath layers of dust, dirt, and years of decay. An object that had survived when memories failed. When investigators carefully removed it from beneath the floor, nobody spoke. They had spent decades chasing rumors. Decades following false leads. Decades wondering if Emily Carter had vanished without leaving behind a final clue. Now that clue was sitting inside an evidence bag. The item was a small piece of fabric. Dark blue. Weathered. Almost destroyed by time. At first glance it appeared meaningless. A torn fragment from an old jacket. A piece of clothing left behind in an abandoned building. But forensic specialists noticed something immediately. The material was not consistent with the clothing Emily was wearing the night she disappeared. It belonged to someone else. Someone who had been inside the farmhouse. Someone whose presence had never been explained. The evidence was sent for examination. And once again, the investigation entered the most difficult stage. Waiting. Because discoveries create hope. But hope can be dangerous. Families of missing people learn this better than anyone. A new clue can feel like the beginning of justice. But it can also become another painful disappointment. Emily's family had experienced that cycle before. Every phone call. Every new investigator. Every possible breakthrough. Each one carried the possibility of answers. And each one carried the fear of another dead end. When Detective Morales called Emily's mother, she did not promise anything. She had learned that promises could hurt. Instead, she simply said, "We found something." For the first time in years, Emily's family felt the weight of possibility again. Meanwhile, investigators focused on Daniel Mercer. The DNA match had already connected him to the necklace. The new evidence could reveal whether he was telling the truth. Mercer remained calm during interviews. Almost too calm. He continued denying involvement. He admitted being at the farmhouse before Emily disappeared. He admitted touching the necklace. But he insisted he never harmed her. He claimed he left Texas because he wanted a different life. He claimed the timing was coincidence. He claimed everyone was searching for a villain, when the truth was simply that Emily had disappeared. But detectives noticed something. Mercer never asked about Emily. He never asked whether she had been found. He never asked what happened to her family. He only asked about the evidence. The questions investigators had. The information they discovered. The things they knew. To Morales that mattered. People who had nothing to hide often wanted answers. People protecting secrets often wanted control. The forensic examination of the fabric fragment took several days. The laboratory analyzed every thread. Every particle. Every trace. The first results were inconclusive. The material was old. Damaged. Partially degraded. But then specialists found something. Microscopic biological material embedded deep inside the fibers. A trace that had survived almost 3 decades. DNA. Another sample. Another chance to hear the truth. The laboratory compared the profile with the existing evidence. The results shocked investigators. The DNA matched Daniel Mercer. Again, this was no longer one piece of evidence. It was a pattern. The necklace. The fabric. The farmhouse. All connected to the same person. But detectives still needed to understand the sequence of events. How did Mercer get close to Emily? Why did she go to the farmhouse? And where was she now? The investigation returned to the night of October 17, 1998. The timeline was reconstructed minute by minute. Emily left work at approximately 6:30 p.m. She stopped at a local grocery store. She called her fiancé. Nothing unusual. Her final confirmed sighting came from a gas station camera. A grainy image showed Emily standing beside her vehicle. She appeared calm. Normal. Nothing suggested danger. Then she disappeared. The next known event was her abandoned car near the farmhouse. But detectives discovered something hidden inside old phone records. A call. Placed from a payphone near the highway. 20 minutes before Emily vanished. The call had been ignored during the original investigation because the number could not be traced. But new analysis revealed something important. The payphone was located less than 1 mile from the farmhouse. Investigators searched the old records again. They found the number the call was made to. A business line. One connected to a construction company where Daniel Mercer had previously worked. A coincidence? Maybe. But another coincidence was becoming harder to believe. Detectives returned to Mercer. This time they confronted him with the new information. The payphone. The company connection. The DNA. The hidden fabric. For the first time, Mercer's confidence began to disappear. He changed his story. Only slightly. But enough. He admitted he had spoken with Emily that night. A statement he had denied for 20 years. He claimed it was only a brief conversation. He said Emily had stopped because she recognized him. He said she asked for help. Then he said he left. Investigators asked the question that had remained unanswered for decades. Why didn't you tell us? Mercer looked down. He did not answer. Silence filled the room. And in that silence, detectives realized something. Mercer had spent 20 years protecting a secret. But he was still protecting something else. Because even with the evidence connecting him to the farmhouse, one mystery remained. What happened after Emily walked onto that property? The investigation had found the person connected to the evidence. But it had not yet found Emily. The search moved deeper. Investigators examined old maps, property records, construction documents. They discovered that after Emily disappeared, part of the land behind the farmhouse had been altered. A section of the property had been filled and covered. At the time, nobody questioned it. The area was considered abandoned. Nobody thought it mattered. Now, it mattered. Teams returned to the farmhouse one more time. The place where the mystery began. The place where decades of silence had finally started to break. As equipment moved across the ground behind the old structure, everyone waited. Because after 28 years, the truth was no longer hidden behind rumors. It was buried beneath the earth. And investigators were finally getting close enough to uncover it. The ground behind the abandoned farmhouse had been untouched for years. At least that was what everyone believed. For nearly 3 decades, investigators had searched the building, the surrounding fields, the nearby roads, and every location connected to Emily Carter's disappearance. They searched where they could see. They searched where they thought evidence might exist. But they never truly searched beneath the surface. Because in 1998, the technology did not exist. The tools were different. The questions were different. And the investigation had been trapped by the limitations of another era. Now in 2019, machines moved slowly across the land behind the farmhouse. The same land where records showed unexpected changes had occurred after Emily disappeared. The same land connected to Daniel Mercer. The same land that had carried a secret for 20 years. Detectives stood several feet away as specialists scanned the area. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to imagine what they might find. Because every investigator working a missing person case knows the moment they discover the truth can be both the greatest victory and the most painful moment of their career. Finding answers means ending uncertainty. But sometimes, the answer is something a family has spent years fearing. The equipment detected something unusual beneath the soil. A disturbance. A section of earth that did not match the surrounding area. Investigators marked the location. Slowly, carefully, they began the excavation. Every layer was documented. Every movement recorded. The first hours produced nothing. Only dirt. Old roots, broken pieces of wood, fragments left behind by decades of weather. The tension began to rise. Then near sunset a technician stopped. A small object appeared beneath the soil. A piece of jewelry. Silver. Weathered. But recognizable. The same design as the necklace Emily Carter had been wearing the night she disappeared. The discovery sent a shock through the investigation team. Because until that moment, Emily's disappearance had remained a mystery. A theory. A question. Now, for the first time, there was a physical connection between the missing woman and the property. The excavation continued. Hours later, investigators discovered human remains. The scene became silent. The kind of silence that only appears when a decades-old mystery finally reaches its most painful moment. After 28 years, Emily Carter had been found. The announcement changed the entire community. People who had grown up hearing her name but never knowing the truth suddenly faced reality. The missing woman who had appeared on posters. The photograph displayed in stores. The person whose family refused to stop searching. She was no longer missing. But justice was not complete. Because finding Emily answered one question. It created another. Who was responsible? Daniel Mercer was already connected to the evidence. But investigators needed to understand exactly what happened. The forensic examination of the remains began immediately. Experts searched for answers hidden inside what time had left behind. The examination was slow. Painfully slow. Every piece of information mattered. Fracture. A trace. Position. A timeline. The investigators who had spent years chasing possibilities now needed facts. Meanwhile, news of the discovery spread throughout Texas. The headline that had disappeared from newspapers decades earlier returned. Emily Carter found after 28 years. The community reacted with a mixture of relief and sadness. Some people had spent years believing she would somehow walk back home. Some had kept old photographs. Some had remembered the night she vanished as if it had happened yesterday. For Emily's family, the discovery brought emotions that were impossible to describe. They finally had an answer. But they also had to face the reality that the person they loved would never return. The investigation focused entirely on Daniel Mercer. After the discovery, his previous statements were examined again. Every interview, every contradiction, every moment of hesitation. Detectives noticed a pattern. Mercer had never completely denied knowing Emily. He had denied only the parts that connected him to her disappearance. That difference mattered. Investigators believed he was not hiding the entire story. Only the part that could destroy him. A second interview was scheduled. This time Mercer arrived knowing the investigation had changed. The farmhouse evidence. The DNA. The remains. The years of silence. The walls were closing in. Morales placed a photograph of Emily on the table. Not a crime scene image. Not evidence. Just Emily. A young woman smiling. A person with a future that disappeared in one night. Then Morales asked, "What happened to her?" For several seconds Mercer stared at the photograph. His expression changed. Not anger. Not fear. Something else. Regret. But regret does not erase responsibility. Mercer finally admitted something investigators had suspected. He had met Emily that night. He had not told the truth. He said Emily stopped at the farmhouse after receiving a phone call from him. A phone call he had denied making. He claimed he wanted to talk. He claimed there was no plan to hurt her. He claimed everything happened because of one argument. One moment. One decision. But investigators knew the difference between an accident and a cover-up. Mercer had spent 28 years hiding the truth. He had allowed Emily's family to search. He had watched the community wonder. He had watched investigators chase impossible theories. And he had remained silent. The confession was incomplete. Questions remained. But for the first time, the investigation had a direct account of what happened inside the farmhouse. Mercer described the confrontation. He said Emily discovered something about him that night. Something he did not want anyone to know. He claimed she threatened to expose him. He claimed he panicked. And then, he stopped talking. The room became silent. Investigators waited. The missing pieces were still there. The most important moments remained unanswered. What happened after the argument? Why was Emily's necklace broken? Why was her car left abandoned? Why did Mercer bury the evidence instead of coming forward? The confession had opened the door. But behind that door was an even darker truth. The final forensic report was still pending, and investigators knew that report would determine whether Daniel Mercer's story was the truth or another carefully constructed lie. Because after 28 years of searching, they had finally found Emily Carter. Now they had to uncover what really happened to her. The confession was not the ending. It was the beginning of the final search for the truth. For 28 years, the questions surrounding Emily Carter's disappearance had been simple. Where did she go? Now investigators finally knew. She had never left the abandoned farmhouse. But another question remained. What exactly happened during the final moments of her life? Because Daniel Mercer's confession was not complete. It was carefully measured. He admitted only what the evidence had already proven. He admitted the meeting. He admitted the argument. He admitted being there. But he stopped before explaining the moment that changed everything. The moment Emily Carter became a missing person. Detective Lena Morales understood something about confessions. They were rarely complete. People rarely reveal the truth because they suddenly decide to tell everything. More often they reveal pieces. Pieces they believe they can survive. Pieces that protect them. Pieces that leave room for doubt. Mercer's story had gaps. Large ones. And investigators were determined to fill every single one. The forensic report from the recovered remains became the most important document in the entire investigation. For years, Emily's family had lived between hope and fear. Now science would finally reveal what happened. The examination showed evidence of trauma. The injuries were consistent with a violent confrontation. The findings contradicted Mercer's early claim that Emily's death was an unavoidable accident. Investigators believed the evidence told a different story. This was not a tragic misunderstanding. This was a crime. The report changed the case from a disappearance investigation into a homicide investigation. And with that change came another wave of questions. Why Emily? Why that night? Why the farmhouse? Investigators returned to Mercer's background. They searched through old records, old relationships, old financial documents, old interviews. They discovered that Mercer had been hiding more than his connection to Emily. Months before her disappearance, he had been involved in another incident. A complaint. A confrontation. Nothing that resulted in criminal charges. Nothing that appeared connected at the time. But it revealed something investigators found important. Mercer had a pattern. When situations became difficult, he avoided them. When questions became uncomfortable, he disappeared. When consequences approached, he created distance. The same pattern appeared after Emily vanished. He left Texas. He changed jobs. He built a new identity. He allowed an entire community to search for someone he already knew was gone. But detectives still needed to understand what triggered the confrontation between Emily and Mercer. The answer came from a witness who had never been considered important. A former coworker named Sarah Whitmore. In 1998, Sarah worked with Emily at the veterinary clinic. She remembered Emily as someone who cared deeply about people. Someone who believed in giving others chances. But Sarah also remembered something unusual in the weeks before Emily disappeared. Emily had been worried. Not frightened. Not yet. But concerned. She had mentioned that someone she knew was keeping a secret. A secret that could hurt other people. At the time, Sarah assumed Emily was talking about a personal disagreement. She never imagined it was connected to a disappearance. Investigators asked Sarah the question nobody had asked 20 years earlier. Did Emily ever mention Daniel Mercer? The room went quiet. Sarah looked down. Then she answered. Yes. She explained that Emily had met Mercer through his construction work near the clinic. At first they barely knew each other. But over time, Emily became uncomfortable with something she discovered about him. Something involving a past relationship. Something involving lies. Something that made her question whether other people were in danger. Sarah could not remember every detail. 2 decades had passed. But one sentence remained in her memory. Emily had said, "If nobody says something, he'll keep doing it." That sentence changed the investigation, because it suggested Emily had not simply met Mercer by coincidence that night. She may have gone there because she intended to confront him, or warn someone, or reveal what she knew. The farmhouse was no longer just a random location. It was where two people with a hidden conflict came face to face. Investigators reconstructed the timeline again. Emily received a phone call. She drove toward the farmhouse. Mercer was there. An argument happened. Her necklace broke. Her DNA remained behind. Her car was abandoned. And then Mercer made the choice that would define the next 28 years. He stayed silent. But investigators still needed one final piece. Motive. Without understanding why, the story remained incomplete. The prosecution needed more than evidence. They needed to explain what happened. Why did Mercer risk everything? Why did he believe he could escape forever? The answer came from another discovery inside the original case files. A document nobody had connected to Emily's disappearance. A police report from several weeks before October 1998. It involved a complaint against Mercer. The report described an argument between Mercer and a former employee. The reason? A stolen identity. Mercer had been using another person's information to obtain work contracts. The issue had never become a major criminal case. The employee dropped the complaint. But investigators realized something important. Emily had worked at a veterinary clinic. A place where records mattered. A place where trust mattered. And according to Sarah Whitmore, Emily had recently become suspicious of Mercer's activities. She may have discovered evidence. Evidence that could expose him. Evidence that could destroy the life he had built. Suddenly, the night of October 17, 1998 looked different. Emily was not randomly taken. She may have been silenced. Because she knew something. Something Mercer could not allow anyone else to discover. The final interview with Daniel Mercer took place several days later. This time, investigators entered the room with everything. The DNA evidence. The forensic findings. The witness statements. The timeline. The motive. Mercer knew the investigation had reached the point where silence was no longer protecting him. For nearly 3 decades he had controlled the story. Now the evidence controlled it. Morales placed the final photograph on the table. Emily Carter, 26 years old. A life interrupted. A family left waiting. Then she asked the question that had remained unanswered since 1998. Why didn't you call for help? Mercer looked at the photograph. His expression changed. And for the first time, he stopped defending himself. He admitted the argument became physical. He admitted Emily tried to leave. He admitted he followed her outside. Then he said something that investigators had been waiting 28 years to hear. I knew I had ruined everything. The confession continued. The missing moments began to appear. But one thing remained. A final decision. A choice made after the crime. A choice that transformed a terrible moment into a decades-long nightmare. Mercer had not only caused Emily's death. He had chosen to hide her. And investigators were about to learn just how far he went to keep the truth buried. For 28 years, Daniel Mercer carried a secret that destroyed one family and haunted an entire community. He had lived through birthdays, holidays, family celebrations, quiet mornings, ordinary days, every moment that Emily Carter never got to experience. And while the world searched for answers, Mercer continued living a life built on silence. But silence has a limit. Evidence has a memory. And after decades of waiting, the truth had finally reached the surface. During the final interview, Mercer admitted what investigators had already begun to understand. He had met Emily at the abandoned farmhouse. He had argued with her. He had followed her outside. And he had made choices that changed everything. But one question remained. What happened after Emily stopped moving? Because the difference between a tragic confrontation and a deliberate crime was hidden inside those final minutes. Detectives needed every detail, every movement, every decision. Mercer's confession came slowly, almost reluctantly. He described the night as if he was watching it happen from a distance. a defense mechanism, a way to separate himself from what he had done. But investigators noticed something. He remembered details. Small details. Details only someone who had been there could know. The position of the vehicle. The broken porch light. The sound of the farmhouse door closing. The cold air moving through the damaged walls. For 28 years, Mercer had claimed the night was a blur. But now, the blur had become a timeline. And the timeline revealed something disturbing. He had more control than he admitted. According to Mercer, after the confrontation escalated, he panicked. He claimed he did not intend for Emily to die. He claimed fear took over. But investigators focused on what happened afterward. Because panic explains a mistake. It does not explain a cover-up. Mercer did not call emergency services. He did not contact Emily's family. He did not tell authorities what happened. Instead, he made a series of decisions. Calculated decisions. He moved Emily away from the main area of the farmhouse. He removed items that could connect him to the scene. He abandoned her vehicle. Then he disappeared from the investigation. Those choices became the foundation of the prosecution's case. Because every action after the crime revealed something important. Awareness. Intent. A desire to avoid responsibility. The discovery also answered another mystery. The broken necklace. For years, investigators wondered how such a small object became the key to solving the entire case. The necklace was not just a piece of jewelry. It was a timestamp. A final physical connection between Emily and the person who caused her death. The struggle had left behind evidence that survived longer than anyone expected. Technology changed. People forgot. Records disappeared. But the DNA remained. And that tiny trace became the voice Emily never had the chance to use. After the confession, investigators returned to the farmhouse one final time. The location looked different now. The fear surrounding it had faded. The rumors had been replaced by facts. The abandoned building was no longer a place of mystery. It was a crime scene that had finally revealed its story. Detectives walked through the rooms where they had searched decades earlier. They remembered the uncertainty, the frustration, the feeling that the truth was always nearby but impossible to reach. One investigator who had worked the original case returned after the discovery. He stood silently on the porch. The same porch where the first clues had been found. The same porch where the investigation had nearly ended before it truly began. He looked at the repaired section of floor and said something simple. We were looking at it the whole time. It was a painful reality of cold cases. The answers are sometimes there from the beginning. But investigators do not have the technology. They do not have the information. They do not know which detail will matter decades later. Emily's case became an example of how science can transform forgotten evidence into undeniable truth. But for the Carter family, the resolution brought complicated emotions. There was relief. After nearly 3 decades of uncertainty, they finally knew what happened. There was anger, because someone had known the truth all along. And there was grief, because justice could never bring Emily back. Her mother kept the same photograph that had been shown during the final interview. The picture of Emily smiling. The picture of a woman who never got to grow older. Never got to see the future she planned. Never got to live the life waiting for her. The trial began months later. The courtroom was filled with years of unanswered questions. Prosecutors presented the evidence piece by piece. The DNA match. The hidden fabric. The farmhouse discovery. The witness statements. The confession. Each piece strengthened the same conclusion. Daniel Mercer was responsible for Emily Carter's death. The defense attempted to challenge parts of the investigation. They questioned the reliability of decades-old memories. They questioned the interpretation of evidence. They questioned the confession. But one thing remained impossible to explain. The DNA. The evidence connecting Mercer to Emily had survived 28 years. It had waded through changing investigators, changing technology, changing lives. And when the time came, it told the story clearly. The jury deliberated for several hours, then returned. The courtroom became completely silent. Daniel Mercer was found guilty. After nearly 3 decades, the case was closed. But the story did not end with the verdict. Because cold cases leave behind more than evidence. They leave behind people. Families who spent years searching. Communities that remembered. Investigators who refused to forget. Emily Carter's name had once represented a mystery. A question. A missing person. Now it represented something else. A reminder that even the oldest secrets can be uncovered. That evidence can survive. That time does not always protect those who hide the truth. Years after Emily disappeared, a single piece of DNA reopened a case everyone believed might never be solved. A tiny trace. A forgotten clue. A silent witness. And after 28 years of waiting, it finally spoke. The verdict brought an ending to the investigation. But it did not erase the years lost. For the people who searched for Emily Carter, justice was not measured only by a courtroom decision. It was measured by every unanswered question that had finally received an answer. Every sleepless night. Every photograph placed in a window. Every holiday spent wondering if a phone call might bring her home. The conviction of Daniel Mercer closed a chapter. But the story of Emily Carter remained. Because behind every cold case is more than evidence. There are families. There are memories. There are moments frozen in time. And there are communities that carry the weight of what happened long after the headlines disappear. For decades, the abandoned farmhouse had represented fear. People drove past it and remembered the mystery. They remembered the woman who vanished. They remembered the investigation that seemed impossible to solve. But after the truth was revealed, the farmhouse became something different. A reminder. A place where science defeated silence. A place where a forgotten clue finally found its meaning. The investigation into Emily Carter's disappearance became one of the most discussed cold cases in the region because of one extraordinary detail. The evidence was never truly gone. It was simply waiting for the right moment. In 1998, the technology was not advanced enough to uncover the story hidden inside a tiny biological trace. The necklace was collected. The fabric fragment was stored. The photographs were preserved. The reports were filed. Everything remained. The problem was not the absence of evidence. The problem was understanding what the evidence was saying. Years later, forensic science changed the entire investigation. DNA technology allowed investigators to examine material that earlier detectives could never have used. A clue once considered meaningless became the foundation of a homicide case. And that transformation changed the way investigators looked at old crimes. Cold cases were no longer forgotten files. They became unfinished stories. Every year, more abandoned investigations were reopened. More evidence was tested. More families received answers they had spent decades waiting for. Emily's case became an example of that new era. A reminder that time does not always protect the guilty. Sometimes time simply gives investigators new tools. After the conviction, Detective Lena Morales spoke publicly about the investigation. She explained that solving the case was not about finding one perfect clue. It was about understanding how every detail connected. The witness who remembered the truck. The old interview where Mercer revealed information he should not have known. The necklace carrying DNA evidence. The forgotten fabric fragment. The property records. The people who refused to stop asking questions. Each piece alone seemed incomplete. Together they created the truth. That was the nature of cold case investigations. They were not solved by one moment. They were solved by patience. By persistence. By investigators willing to return to places where others had already searched. The Carter family also became advocates for missing persons awareness. They spoke about the importance of keeping cases alive. Because many families never received the answers Emily's family finally received. Many continue waiting. Many continue searching. Many continue hoping. Emily's mother often repeated one message. A person should never become just a file number. Never just a photograph. Never just a headline. Every missing person represents a life. A family. A future that mattered. The story of Emily Carter was never only about the person responsible. It was about the person lost. Friends remembered her kindness. Her sense of humor. Her habit of helping injured animals at the veterinary clinic. They remembered someone who wanted to make the world better in small ways. Someone whose life was interrupted far too soon. Those memories became more important than the crime itself. Because crimes create fear. But people create meaning. Years after the investigation ended, the town continued changing. New businesses opened. Old buildings disappeared. Highways expanded. New generations grew up. Many residents who now passed the farmhouse had never known the mystery that once surrounded it. But for those who remembered, the night of October 17, 1998 remained unforgettable. It was the night a community lost someone. The night a family began a search that would last decades. The night an investigation began that would challenge generations of detectives. And eventually, the night that would lead to one of the most unexpected breakthroughs in the county's history. The final report on Emily's case remained stored alongside thousands of other investigations. But unlike many cold case files, this one carried a different message. It proved that unanswered does not mean unsolvable. It proved that forgotten does not mean lost. And it proved that even the smallest piece of evidence can survive long enough to reveal the truth. The DNA that changed everything was smaller than a grain of dust. Could have disappeared. Could have been destroyed. Could have been overlooked forever. But it remained. Waiting. Silent. Until someone finally listened. The case of Emily Carter became a symbol of the power of modern investigation. A story of technology, persistence, and the human need for answers. But perhaps the most haunting part of the entire case was not how it was solved. It was how close the truth had been all along. The evidence existed. The clues existed. The answers were there. They were hidden inside old photographs, old statements, old memories, waiting for someone to look again. Because sometimes the difference between an unsolved mystery and a solved crime is not a new discovery. Sometimes, it is seeing an old clue in a completely new way. And for Emily Carter, after 28 years of silence, that second chance at the truth finally came. The world often remembers the moment a cold case is solved. The arrest. The courtroom. The headline announcing that a mystery has finally ended. But what many people never see are the years before that moment. The years filled with uncertainty. The years when investigators had nothing but questions. The years when families learned to live with an absence that never truly became normal. For Emily Carter's family, the end of the investigation was not a celebration. It was a moment filled with emotions that could not exist separately. Relief, pain, anger, peace, all at once. Because solving a cold case does not erase the past. It does not return the years that were stolen. It does not bring back the conversations that never happened. The birthdays missed. The memories never created. It only brings the truth. And sometimes the truth is the one thing people have been waiting for their entire lives. After the trial ended, investigators continued reviewing the case. Not because they doubted the verdict, but because professionals who work cold cases understand something important. A solved case still has a story. Every decision matters. Every piece of evidence has a reason it survived. And every person connected to the investigation leaves behind a part of the journey. Detective Lena Morales returned to the original evidence room several months after the conviction. The boxes were still there. The same boxes that had waited through decades of silence. Inside were the remains of an investigation that had once seemed impossible. Old photographs, handwritten notes, evidence reports, witness statements, items that had once represented failure. Now they represented persistence. Morales looked through the documents one more time. She stopped at the first report from 1998. The report written by investigators who had searched the farmhouse when Emily first disappeared. She understood something that many people outside law enforcement never see. The original investigators were not wrong. They were fighting a different battle. They had limited technology, limited resources, limited information. They searched based on what they knew. The investigators who reopened the case searched based on what science had become. That difference changed everything. The discovery of Emily Carter's DNA evidence became a powerful example of how forensic science continues evolving. A clue that once had no identity could later become a fingerprint of the past. A trace too small to notice could become the strongest voice in the investigation. The necklace that sat in storage for years became the connection between two timelines. the night Emily disappeared, and the day the truth finally emerged. The case also changed the way the community viewed abandoned investigations. For decades, some people believed cold cases were simply forgotten, files that disappeared into cabinets, stories that ended without answers. But Emily's case proved something different. A cold case is not a closed door. It is a door waiting for the right key. Sometimes that key is new technology. Sometimes it is a witness remembering one forgotten detail. Sometimes it is an investigator willing to ask a question nobody thought to ask. In this case, it was all three: the truck, the necklace, the DNA, the hidden evidence beneath the farmhouse, the memories that survived 28 years. Each piece carried a small part of the truth. Together, they created a story that could no longer be ignored. For the people of the county, the resolution brought an unexpected feeling. The fear surrounding Emily's disappearance began to fade. The rumors stopped. The theories disappeared. The farmhouse was no longer a place where people imagined impossible stories. It became a reminder of reality. A reminder that behind every mystery is a human being. Emily was no longer only known as the woman who vanished. She was remembered as the woman she had been. A daughter. A friend. A caregiver. Someone who loved animals. Someone who wanted a future. Someone whose life mattered beyond the crime that ended it. That became the most important message after the investigation concluded. The story was never supposed to belong to the person responsible. It belonged to Emily. Her name appeared in headlines for years because something terrible happened. But eventually, her name represented something else. Hope. Hope that families would continue searching. Hope that evidence would continue speaking. Hope that no case was truly forgotten. The investigators involved in Emily's case often talked about one moment that stayed with them. Not the arrest. Not the confession. Not the verdict. The moment they found the first real breakthrough. The moment they realized the case was not finished. Because before every solved case, there is a moment when someone chooses not to give up. Someone opens an old file. Someone reviews an old photograph. Someone notices something everyone else missed. That moment changes everything. And in Emily Carter's case, it began with a tiny piece of evidence that had waited nearly 3 decades to reveal its secret. The world sees the final headline. Cold case solved. But behind those 3 words are years of pain and determination. Years of families waiting. Years of investigators searching. Years of evidence surviving. The final answer may arrive in a single day. But the journey toward that answer can last a lifetime. And that is why cold cases continue to matter. Because every unsolved case represents someone who deserves to be remembered. Someone who deserves the truth. Someone whose story deserves an ending. For Emily Carter, that ending finally came. Not quickly. Not easily. But after 28 years, the silence was broken. And the mystery that once seemed impossible became a lesson written in evidence, patience, and determination. A reminder that time can hide the truth. But time cannot always destroy it. Because somewhere inside every forgotten investigation, there may still be a clue waiting. Waiting for science. Waiting for persistence. Waiting for someone to look again. 28 years. That was the distance between the night Emily Carter disappeared and the moment the truth finally emerged. 28 years of unanswered questions. 28 years of a family searching for a person they refused to believe was forgotten. 28 years of an investigation that remained alive, even when hope became difficult to hold. The world eventually saw the final headline. A cold case solved. A suspect identified. A mystery finally answered. But the real story was never just about how investigators found Daniel Mercer. It was about why they never stopped looking for Emily. Because behind every cold case is a promise. A promise that a person's story does not disappear simply because time passes. A promise that silence does not mean the truth is gone. A promise that somewhere, somehow, evidence may still be waiting. Emily Carter's case became a reminder of that promise. The farmhouse where she disappeared had once represented everything investigators feared. A place with too many questions. Too few answers. A place where every search seemed to lead nowhere. For years, people believed the truth was buried there forever. But the farmhouse was not hiding the truth. It was preserving it. The evidence survived. The memories survived. And eventually the technology caught up. That was the moment everything changed. The smallest clues became the strongest evidence. The forgotten necklace became the connection between past and present. The old witness statement became a missing piece of the timeline. The hidden fabric fragment became proof that someone had been there. The DNA became the voice of evidence. And after decades of silence, that voice became impossible to ignore. For investigators, the case represented something larger than one solved crime. It represented the evolution of forensic science. In 1998, detectives had searched with everything available to them. They followed every lead. They interviewed every person they could find. They examined every piece of evidence they understood. But science changes. Technology improves. Methods evolve. A clue that once appeared meaningless can become the most important discovery in an investigation. That is the reality of cold cases. They do not remain frozen. They wait. Years later, new questions can reveal old answers. New tools can unlock forgotten evidence. And new investigators can see possibilities that previous generations could not. The resolution of Emily's case also changed the community that had carried the mystery for so long. The rumors ended. The theories faded. The fear disappeared. People no longer drove past the abandoned farmhouse wondering what might have happened there. They knew. And while the truth was painful, uncertainty had finally been replaced by reality. For Emily's family, that reality came with complicated emotions. They received the answers they had spent decades seeking. But answers cannot replace a person. They cannot restore lost time. They cannot undo the pain of waiting. They can only bring peace where there was once endless uncertainty. Emily's mother continued keeping photographs of her daughter. Not crime scene images. Not newspaper clippings. Not pictures connected to the investigation. Just Emily. Smiling. Living. Being herself. Because that was how she wanted her daughter remembered. Not as a mystery. Not as a headline. Not as a cold case. As a person. Person who had dreams. Person who had loved ones. A person whose life mattered. The investigators who worked the case also carried the memory with them. They knew the outcome was rare. Many families continue waiting for answers.